For decades, Alzheimer's has been one of the biggest medical mysteries out there. We could see the damage it did to the brain, but for most people, we had absolutely no idea what was causing it. It was like a massive cold case that had stumped scientists for generations. Well, let's dive into the new evidence that just blew this whole case wide open.
So first, you gotta understand the sheer scale of this thing. A whopping 95% of all Alzheimer's cases are what scientists call sporadic. That's just a fancy way of saying they don't seem to run in families and aren't caused by some gene you inherit from your parents. So this isn't some tiny little puzzle. This is the puzzle for almost everyone affected by this disease.
All right, so what exactly is this disease we're investigating? Well, at its core, Alzheimer's is a progressive disorder that basically wages war on our brain cells. It causes these sticky things called amyloid plaques to build up, it severs the crucial connections between neurons, and eventually it leads to widespread cell death. And the prefrontal cortex, our brain's command center, it gets hit especially hard. Now, to crack the massive mystery of the 95%, investigators had to start with the only part they did understand, that tiny 5% of cases that are clearly inherited. This was the first real clue, the first thread to pull in the entire investigation. And this really breaks the disease down into two different stories. On one hand, you've got familial Alzheimer's. It's super rare, less than 5% of all cases, and it's caused by specific gene mutations that are in every single cell of a person's body from birth. A key culprit here is a gene called the amyloid precursor protein, or APP for short. Then, on the other side, you have sporadic Alzheimer's, the form that affects almost everyone else with no clear genetic smoking gun. The APP gene always seemed like the obvious suspect, but for the longest time, the evidence just wasn't there. So, why? Why was the prime suspect, this APP gene, taken off the table so early in the investigation? This is exactly where the case went cold for decades. See, back in the 1980s, researchers looked for extra copies of the APP gene in the brains of people with sporadic Alzheimer's. But here's the catch. Their technique was to analyze bulk brain tissue. They were basically mashing up thousands of cells at once and looking at the average. And when they did that, they found nothing. The amount of APP DNA looked totally normal, so case closed. The most promising lead anyone had was a dead end, or so they thought. And then the whole case was blown wide open by a really revolutionary idea, one that challenged something we all learned in biology class, the assumption that every single cell in our body has the exact same DNA. This idea has a name: genomic mosaicism. It's the discovery that our bodies aren't genetically uniform. They're actually a patchwork, a mosaic of cells with slightly different genomes. And it turns out this is especially common in our brain cells. This was the game-changing lead that let scientists look at that old, cold case with a completely fresh set of eyes. And listen, this isn't some wild, out-there theory. Genomic mosaicism is a well-known, documented thing. It can show up in a bunch of different ways, like cells having the wrong number of chromosomes, or little bits of DNA that literally jump around the genome, or even entire genes being duplicated over and over. The point is, this idea that we have genetic variations within our own bodies is very, very real. So, armed with this new insight, researchers developed a totally new forensic technique. They thought, okay, instead of looking at a blurry average of thousands of cells, what if we could zoom in way in and inspect the DNA of one single brain cell at a time? And here is the very first piece of evidence that came out of that approach. Okay, look at the image on the left. That's DNA from healthy brain cells. See how it makes that nice, sharp, narrow peak? Now look at the graph on the right. That's from the brains of sporadic Alzheimer's patients. Whoa, the graph is way wider and it's shifted to the right. This is basically a visual fingerprint telling us that something is very different. These cells have more DNA. So just how much more are we talking about? Well, while healthy neurons had a tiny increase, the neurons from sporadic Alzheimer's brains had, on average, an 8.2% increase in their total DNA. Now, that might not sound like a huge number, but in the world of genetics, it's massive. It's like finding hundreds of millions of extra letters suddenly added into the book of life in a single cell. And that, of course, led to the million-dollar question. What was all that extra DNA? The answer would finally reveal the smoking gun that had been hiding in plain sight for all these years. It turns out the original suspect was back. That extra DNA contained extra copies, lots of them, of the APP gene. The very same gene from the rare inherited form of the disease was found super amplified inside individual brain cells of the common sporadic form. I mean, some neurons had 4, 8, they found one with up to 12 copies of this single gene. Unbelievable.
But wait, a good detective always has to check every angle, right? The APP gene sits on chromosome 21, and we know that people with Down syndrome, who have a full extra copy of chromosome 21, almost always develop Alzheimer's pathology. So could this just be a sign that these specific brain cells had a form of mosaic Down syndrome?
To figure that out, the researchers ran another test. They used these fluorescent probes that light up to literally count the number of copies of chromosome 21 inside each cell. The result? Nope. There was no significant increase in cells with a whole extra chromosome. This was the proof. The extra APP genes weren't coming from an extra chromosome. It was a much more specific, targeted attack on just that one critical gene. So what does it all mean? What does finding this hidden genetic culprit actually change? Well, it doesn't just solve a decades-old cold case. It completely redraws the map for Alzheimer's research going forward. Look, this is way more than just a new clue. It's a total paradigm shift. For the very first time, we have a real plausible genetic explanation for the 95% of cases. It proves that this genomic mosaicism isn't just some weird biological quirk. It can be a direct driver of a major disease. We used to think of Alzheimer's as either something you inherit or something caused by your environment. This discovery shows us a third path. It can be an acquired genetic disease, one that develops inside our own cells over our lifetime. That blows the whole case wide open and gives us brand new questions to ask, and most importantly, brand new molecular targets to aim for in the fight for a cure.
And this leaves us with a pretty fascinating thought to end on. We now know our brains aren't these uniform machines. They're these incredibly complex mosaics of genetically different cells. Cracking the cold case of sporadic Alzheimer's might just be the beginning. You have to wonder, what other secrets about how our brains work or even about other neurological diseases are hiding inside that beautiful, complicated mosaic?